Hi, friend. Thank you so much for being a part of the Simply Bible Jonah story. I wish you were here that we might talk about this a little bit. I wonder if you, like me, feel like you have more assurance, somehow a greater insight, like some clouds have been pushed away, that we might see God's heart of grace and compassion and mercy. I don't know. Somehow it's hard for me to put into words, but somehow I feel more rooted and grounded in my understanding of God's grace. I feel like the story of Jonah has just highlighted that in the most beautiful way possible. It's been a strong visual of God's grace in action. Really, we get to see his grace and his compassion in action and through real people. So I finished the study just greatly rejoicing in who God is. That yes, as Jonah said, what verse is that? In Jonah chapter 4, verse 2, Jonah says, "For I knew that you are a gracious God, merciful, slow to anger, steadfast in love, and relenting from disaster." Like Jonah knew God. He really does. He's a prophet. He's a man of God. He knows the will of God. He knows how to interpret the will of God. He knows God's heart. And it's why he ran off in the opposite direction. From the beginning, he did not agree with God that God should relent from destroying the people of Nineveh, did he? He says that. He tells us that in Jonah chapter 4. So we see this man of God, which I hope that we can all relate to as men and women of God, that Jonah knows God, he knows his heart, but Jonah does not trust God and his heart of compassion and his heart of grace when Jonah wants to pour that out on his enemies, right? So Jonah was called by God. Remember that? Arise, go, call out to this people of Nineveh. He was to go to Nineveh. Jonah goes the complete opposite direction. He wants to flee from this God of mercy and grace. And we know what happens after that. But God in his grace, like here's where we see God's grace when Jonah is in the pit of all pits. Jonah's life is ebbing away. He is dying, and God graciously appoints this fish to swallow up Jonah, provide Jonah with this opportunity to once again see who he is, that he is a God of mercy and grace, and see what it feels like to be a recipient of his mercy and grace and compassion and to relent from disaster. Jonah gets to experience that. He rejoices in that. He praises God. He thanks God in that beautiful prayer of Jonah chapter 2. And so he experiences that, and it's a beautiful thing when we see God giving Jonah a second chance. God appoints that fish again to just spit Jonah out. Where? Like I was amazed by that, onto dry land. And then he gives Jonah a second chance to go to the people of Nineveh. And Jonah does. He does trust God. He does obey God. He does step foot into the city of Nineveh. Friends, that had to be a hard step. So we can't just look down on Jonah and say, "Oh, Jonah. No, Jonah, we got to see ourselves in Jonah, that Jonah is trying and he is seeking to obey God, but his heart isn't quite at one with God's heart. His thoughts aren't quite at one with God's thoughts, with God's heart and his thoughts of compassion and mercy and forgiveness and relenting from disaster. So once again, as we talked about in our last session, God is again gracious with Jonah. He engages Jonah in this conversation that we see in Jonah chapter 4. Well, you know what? I kind of just skipped over the people of Nineveh actually repenting and mourning and turning to God from their evil ways. Like, this book, this little short book, is full of God's miracles and full of God's grace. I hope that jumped out to you as it did to me. So this last chapter, chapter 4, I just see God's grace in engaging Jonah in this conversation, in helping Jonah work out his own wrong thinking and help Jonah have a heart united with his heart of compassion and grace and mercy towards others and towards the enemy, towards these people of Nineveh. And this whole book ends with a couple of questions, I think, to ponder that we can take away as well. Do you do well to be angry? I am going to remember and hold on to that question. I think that will be useful. And I really believe that God is going to bring that question up to me time and time again when I am not doing well to be angry. You know what I'm saying? So that's good. But then there's this reminder. The whole book ends with this reminder of, or this question of God. Look, Jonah, you pity a plant. Ought not I pity these thousands upon thousands upon thousands, like this multitude, this crowd of people in this city of Nineveh? Oh, friends. We come face to face and we have to grapple with God's heart of compassion and grace and mercy and forgiveness when it comes to God pouring that out and showering it upon others, especially those who have hurt us, or especially those we might look upon with some sort of prejudice, some sort of judgment. Here's a call that our thoughts and our heart be aligned with God's heart and his mind. The people, the original hearers of this story, I believe, would have had to grapple with God's compassion and grace and mercy towards the people of Nineveh. And I think that should be us. Is there anyone, let's not end this study without considering, is there anyone that we need to forgive? We need to be united with God in his heart of compassion and grace and mercy. Is there any way? Then if so, let's allow God to search us and know us. Let's pray openly and honestly with God and just let him know we're struggling in that way and seek to be at one with him. Friends, what a beautiful book. I don't want it to end. It's a short story, but it is a powerful story. The story of Jonah, a prophet who knows the will of God, knows the heart of God, but makes his own mistakes. And we see God being very, very gracious to Jonah. We see God being very, very gracious to those sailors who were calling out to various gods. That has to hurt God's heart, you know what I mean? But God was very, very gracious to them. And then we see God being very, very gracious to the evil people in the city of Nineveh. Oh, God's heart of grace. It's just huge. And I feel like, as I said earlier, that some clouds have been taken away, that I see clearly just how great God's grace is. it's as if, it's as if the sun is shining a little bit brighter. I don't know. Do you have this way? I feel like I have this way of putting God in a box. And then he has this way, the more I study his word to know him and enjoy him, he has this way of kind of blowing up that box. And then there's a bigger box, and this one just got way bigger. I see so much more of his grace and compassion. I hope that you do too. Friends, this ought to give us great assurance, great hope. Let us be rooted and grounded in the steadfast love and faithfulness and grace and mercy of the Lord.